My name is Liam O'Rourke, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this afternoon. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civil and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse any political issues or candidates. Before we begin this afternoon's program, I'd like to just remind you to turn off any cell phones or other devices that make any noise. Today's speaker, Professor Joseph Spoerl, is the chair of the philosophy department here at St. College. His research interests include ethics, philosophy of religion, Islam, and anti-Semitism. Today, Professor Spoerl will be joining us for a discussion entitled Islamist Jew-Hatred and Lessons of History, as part of the Faculty Research Colloquium series. We'll speak about two distinct, especially severe hatreds of Jews, the scientific pseudo-Darwinian racism of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, and the theological anti-Semitism of the Islamic revival, represented by such groups as the Muslim Brotherhood. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Joseph Spoerl.
Well, thank you very much. And can you hear me okay? I'll try, if my voice volume falls, just raise your hand and I'll try to speak louder. I'm speaking, first of all, I want to make it clear that I'm speaking about Islamism, which is a term that was coined maybe 30 or so years ago by European scholars to designate the highly politicized forms of Islam that have flourished roughly since the 1920s in many parts of the Muslim world. So Islamism is a political ideology. I really should say ideologies. There are different versions of them, just as there are different versions of Islam. Not all Muslims are Islamists. That's very important to remember. So I will be talking about connections to the Islamic tradition itself more broadly, but Islamism, strictly speaking, is not really the same as Islam. So let's remember that. And okay, so, and I want to begin, first of all, with some lessons of history. I want to begin with the most poisonous fruit of 1900 years of Christian hatred for Jews. And that is a work called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This first appeared in Russia in 1905. And scholars have done a lot of research on it and pieced together its provenance. The most probable interpretation is that this was an anti-Jewish forgery put together by Russian Tsarist secret police officials working in France in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Russia, as you may know, was an extremely anti-Semitic country. Hostility towards Jews was ramping up in the late 1800s. There were a series of pogroms or organized riots designed to drive Jews out of the Tsarist realm. And the Protocols is a product of that milieu and that effort. So we know that it's a forgery. We know that it's not an authentic document, but it purports to describe an alleged Jewish conspiracy to conquer the world and to destroy non-Jews. It purports to be the rules or the protocols of the global leaders of the Jewish community, the Elders of Zion, in which they lay out their plan for world conquest and world domination. A couple of key quotes from this document. We, that is the Jews, are allegedly interested in the diminution, the killing out of the Goyim, that is the non-Jews. When we come into our kingdom, it will be undesirable for us that there should exist any other religion than ours. We must therefore sweep away all other forms of belief. So you can see that this document attributes to Jews worldwide essentially a genocidal program against non-Jews. So those who accept it as an authentic document therefore regard all Jews the world over as the enemies of non-Jews. You can see it's a very hateful and destructive document. Here's a cover of the English translation. The first English translations appeared in 1920, one in Great Britain, one in the United States. The American edition was disseminated by Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, who was a prominent and vitriolic anti-Semite. You can see the Jewish snake encircling the globe and strangling it here. So A very important point about the protocols is that it was its first German edition appeared in the late 1919, and it was immediately embraced by the far right, including by Adolf Hitler and his compatriots. Hitler wrote, "I have read the protocols. It simply appalled me. The stealthiness of the enemy and his ubiquity. I saw at once that we must copy it in our own way, of course. It is in truth the critical battle for the fate of the world." That last sentence is very important. This is the critical battle for the fate of the world. This is the ultimate struggle between light and darkness, between good and evil. And so, in Hitler's worldview, and in the worldview and propaganda of the top Nazis, we find this stark either-or. Hitler said in 1942, "We fully realize that this war can end only in the extermination of the Aryan peoples, the Germans, or in the disappearance of Jewry in Europe." Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, said in October 1943, addressing a group of SS officers, "We had a moral duty towards our people," the Germans that is, "the duty to exterminate this people, the Jews, which wanted to exterminate us. Either we exterminate them or they will exterminate us. There's no third possibility here." Here's an example from Joseph Goebbels, who was the head of Nazi propaganda. So in February 1943, he would every week give directives to the German press telling them what they ought to be writing stories on. There was, of course, no freedom of the press. Stress: if we lose the war, we do not fall into the hands of some other states, but will all be annihilated by world Jewry. Jewry is firmly decided to exterminate all Germans. There's an excellent book by the American historian Jeffrey Herf called "The Jewish Enemy, Nazi Propaganda During World War II and the Holocaust," published by Harvard University Press, 2007, in which he gives 300 pages of example after example like this. And when you get to the end of that book, you suddenly realize there's no way the average German did not know that the Hitlers were committing genocide against the Jews. The Nazi propaganda proclaimed it on a nearly daily basis. So, what's the lesson of history? Here I quote from Norman Cohn's classic study of the protocols, "Warrant for Genocide, The Myth of the Jewish World Conspiracy and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion," which came out in 1966. "The deadliest kind of anti-Semitism, the kind that results in massacre and attempted genocide, has little to do with real conflicts of interest between living people, or even with racial prejudice as such. At its heart lies the belief that Jews form a conspiratorial body set on ruining and then dominating the rest of mankind." So that's the moral of the story. That's the lesson of history that I want to zero in on here. Wherever we see an ideology, a worldview that embraces this view that the Jews are organizing to destroy us, all of us, whoever us would be, the Aryan peoples, the Germans, Christians, Muslims, whatever, we should pay close attention. That's a very dangerous sign that we are dealing with a potentially genocidal worldview. So now I want to shift my focus from the Western world to the world of Islam. Because to understand Islamist anti-Semitism, we have to go right back to the very birth of Islam. As it happens, both Christianity and Islam, the two largest religions in the world, were born in conflict with Jews and Judaism. And so both traditions have spawned a large body of anti-Jewish polemics and stereotypes. We're a little more familiar with the Christian tradition in this regard, but a less well-known fact is that this is true of Islam as well. So, while in Mecca, Muhammad claimed to be receiving revelations from God, which were eventually collected together in the Quran. So here is a key verse from chapter 7, verse 157 of the Quran. Muhammad, we are told, is the apostle, the unlettered prophet, that is, the illiterate prophet, whom they shall find described to them in the Torah and the Gospel. So here Muhammad is saying, it's a matter of divine revelation, that Muhammad is identified as a prophet in both the Torah, the Jewish scriptures, and the Gospel, the Christian scriptures. And so Christians and Jews have no excuse for not accepting Muhammad as a prophet. Their own scriptures tell them to accept Muhammad. In 622, Muhammad migrated from Mecca to Medina in the famous Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Medina. And there, for the first time, he encountered large numbers of Jews. There were 3 major Jewish tribes in Medina. And he immediately came into conflict with the rabbis. Here's what the rabbis said to Muhammad: "O Muhammad, you have not brought us anything that we recognize. For our part, we cannot see that it is arranged as the Torah is, that the Quran, or the divine revelation, is arranged as the Torah is." In other words, they're saying, Muhammad, we don't find in the Torah what you say is there. Now, Muhammad was illiterate. He certainly was not literate in Hebrew. The rabbis can read Hebrew. They know what's in the Torah. So you can imagine that they would be a little bit irritated by Muhammad coming and telling them, you guys, good news, I'm the final prophet. I'm the one you've been reading about in the Torah all these many centuries. Now I'm here. And he was miffed that he wasn't received with open arms. Muhammad responds, "You know quite well, it is from God. You will find it written in the Torah, which you have." So the stage is set for a rather, shall we say, not a meeting of minds, a clash, a theological clash, where Muhammad is effectively claiming the Torah for himself and for Islam, and the rabbis are saying, sorry, Muhammad, we don't find in the Torah what you say is there. So the result of this is that anti-Jewish polemics actually permeate the Islamic tradition. So here's a quote from the earliest extant biography of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq's Life of the Prophet of God, which we have in a recension from Ibn Hisham from the 9th century. "The Jews are a nation of liars, a treacherous, lying, and evil people. They lie about what is in the Holy Scriptures God has entrusted to them. The Jews are hostile to Islam. The Quran says, chapter 5, verse 82, thou wilt surely find the most hostile of men to the believers are the Jews and the idolaters." Another verse in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 61, says, "And abasement and poverty were pitched upon them," the Jews, "and they were laden with God's anger." This is a curse against the Jews that would echo down through the centuries in Islamic history. One of the leading historical experts on the history of Jewish-Muslim relations is a scholar named Haggai ben Shammai. He studied the history of Islamic exegesis of this verse. He looked at all the Islamic commentaries on the Quran, focusing on the discussion of this verse. And here is what he found. To all of the Muslim exegetes, without exception, it was absolutely clear that the reference was to the Jews of their day, not to Jews in the ancient past. The Arabic word translated as pitched upon them also means, literally, that the abasement and poverty were decreed for them forever. So in the worldview of classical Islam, and there are modern Muslims who are trying to move beyond this to embrace more progressive forms of Islam, but in the classical view of medieval Islam, the Jews were supposed to be beneath the Muslims. The Jews were supposed to live in a socially inferior state, in a humiliated state, under firm Muslim control. That was their divinely ordained station in life. So, fast forward to the year 1948. The Jewish movement known as Zionism succeeds in establishing the country of Israel, establishing modern Israel, after a ferocious series of battles, first with Palestinian Arab militia, dominated overwhelmingly by Sunni Muslims. About 90% of Palestinian Arabs are and were Sunni Muslims. And then eventually defeating invading forces from all the major surrounding Arab countries. The Jews defeat the Muslims. A reversal of the divinely prescribed order. The world turned upside down for a traditional Sunni Muslim. A totally unacceptable state of affairs. A violation of the divinely prescribed order of things. So, this brings us to the birth of this ideology known as Islamism, which is, as I said, rooted in classical Islamic themes, but also not to be totally identified with the religion of Islam. Here is, on the left, a man named Haj Amin al-Husseini, one of the most important early Islamists, meeting with Adolf Hitler on November 28, 1941. So Husseini was the most important leader of the Palestinian Arabs. He held the 4 most powerful offices in Palestinian Arab society in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He was the Mufti of Jerusalem, that is the chief Islamic legal expert in Jerusalem. He was the president of the Supreme Muslim Council, which controlled mosques and Islamic schools and endowments in Palestine. He was head of the Arab Higher Committee, the coordinating body for all the Palestinian Arab political parties, and he was the head of the Palestine Arab Party, the single most powerful Palestinian Arab political party. And he was an enthusiastic collaborator with Adolf Hitler, who totally rejected any peaceful compromise with the Zionists over Palestine. He said, "We will settle this by force and by force only." So, let me quote a few things from a few of the more important public statements by Husseini. In 1937, he issued a proclamation by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem to the Muslim world. And in this proclamation, he said the following, among other things: "The Jews hate Muhammad and Islam. The battle between the Jews and Islam began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. The verses from the Quran and the Hadith," these are the traditional sayings of Muhammad, "prove to you that the Jews have been the bitterest of enemies of Islam and continue to try to destroy it." So notice what he's doing here. He's taking the struggle over Palestine and he's linking it up to the ancient history of Islam going back to the time of Muhammad. Just as the Jews were opposed to Islam and to Muhammad then, so too they continue to try to destroy Islam. To destroy Islam. The very religion of Islam is battling for its existence now against this Jewish enemy who we know from Islamic history was up to this no good stuff 1400 years ago as well. So in this proclamation, he actually uses only Islamic themes. Everything in the 1937 proclamation is taken from Islamic history. We do know that he was already citing the protocols of the Elders of Zion, however. In 1929, he used the protocols to stir up pogroms against Jews all over Palestine, for example. So he himself was aware of the protocols, and he was going to read it in light of Islamic history. From 1941 to 45, Husseini was in Nazi Germany. He collaborated with the Nazis, above all, by writing and broadcasting Arabic language propaganda that the Nazis then beamed by shortwave radio and by leaflet distribution all over North Africa and the Middle East. And in these broadcasts and pamphlets, Husseini said, "The Jews wish to wipe out the Arabs and Islam. The Jews have been the enemies of the Arabs and Islam since its emergence. World War II," he argued, "is a war for the survival of the Arabs and Islam. And just as Hitler incited genocide against the Jews, either they wipe us out or we wipe them out, so too Haj Amin al-Husseini incited genocide. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion." Was one such example. And in 1954, after the war was over, after the War of 1948 was over, in a newspaper affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood in Cairo, Husseini wrote a series of articles which were later published as a book, and he made this kind of statement: "Our battle with world Jewry is a crucial and most important battle, and we must know that it is a question of life and death, a battle between two conflicting faiths, each of which can exist only on the ruins of the other. Either they wipe us out or we wipe them out." Now, Husseini had close connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, the most important Sunni Arab Islamist movement. Al-Banna was a key figure in the rise of modern Islamist ideologies. Husseini was his close friend and a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Indeed, Hassan al-Banna appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini as his personal representative to the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. Another very important Muslim Brotherhood thinker was Sayyid Qutb, arguably the single most influential Muslim Brotherhood theologian. He wrote a book called Our Struggle with the Jews, which came out around 1950. Husseini was in Cairo around the same time. He knew Qutb personally. And in this very important work, Sayyid Qutb wrote, "The Muslim community continues to suffer from the same Jewish machinations and double dealing that discomfited the early Muslims." So notice how he links the struggle with Zionism back to early Islamic history. The agents of Zionism, quote, "agree with each other on one issue, which is the destruction of this Islamic creed. They are out to destroy Islam. The struggle between Islam and the Jews continues in force and will thus continue because the Jews will be satisfied only with the destruction of this religion, Islam." In other words, the battle over Palestine is really part of a much larger battle, the battle for the very survival of Islam against an ancient Jewish enemy that has been opposing Islam for 1,400 years. Now, in 1988, the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine took a new name, the name of Hamas, which actually is an acronym meaning the Islamic Resistance Movement. They issued their foundational document, the Hamas Covenant, in 1988. And in the covenant, among many other things, they say the Zionist plan has no limits, and after Palestine, they want to expand indefinitely. Their plan is expounded in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is from Article 32 of the Hamas Covenant. In Article 28, they write, the Zionist aim is to break societies, to undermine values, destroy people's honor, create moral degeneration, and annihilate Islam. I've underlined the key words there, annihilate Islam. All of these themes could be taken right out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In fact, the Hamas Covenant is a blend of the Islamic tradition and its traditional anti-Jewish polemics and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Theme after theme from the Protocols appears there in this Islamicized form. So, because the Jews are out to annihilate Islam, because it's a matter of us or them, either they annihilate us or we annihilate them, Hamas repeatedly incites genocide against Jews. So here's an example from October 13th, 2015. These are all taken from the Hamas TV station, Al-Aqsa TV, which is based in the Gaza Strip. "We will not leave a single one of you alive or dead on this land. By Allah, we will dig up your bones from the graves and get them out of this country." July 25th, 2014. "Our doctrine in fighting you, the Jews, is that we will totally exterminate you. We will not leave a single one of you alive." March 19th, 2010. "By Allah, they, the Jews, are not human beings. They are not men who deserve to live. Only a madman can possibly think that the Jews are human." That last statement was made by Abdullah Jarboub, who at the time was Deputy Minister for Islamic Endowments in the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. Hamas won the elections in the Palestinian territories in 2006. The Ministry for Islamic Endowments is in charge of running the mosques and Islamic schools in the Gaza Strip. So this is the kind of guy who's appointing the preachers and the teachers in those mosques and schools. You can imagine what the homilies are like, and there are many examples online of such homilies. So let me now shift from the world of Sunni Islam to the world of Shiite Islam and talk for a moment about the Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini lived from 1902 to 1989. He led, of course, the successful Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, which led to the toppling of the Shah of Iran, who had been an ally of the United States and also closely aligned to Israel, and replaced it with the Islamic Republic of Iran, which still exists and continues to cause problems throughout the region. So in 1970, Khomeini wrote a very important work called The Islamic State. And throughout his writings, he again and again makes certain claims about the Jews. Here are some examples. From the beginning, Islam has had to contend with the Jews, for it was they who first established anti-Islamic propaganda and engaged in various stratagems. And this activity continues down to the present. From the time of Muhammad to Israel today, it's the same Jewish plot against Islam. 300 years ago, the Jews were joined by the Western imperialists, whose goal is, quote, the extirpation of Islam. The Jews and their foreign backers are opposed to the very foundations of Islam and wish to establish Jewish domination throughout the world. Iranian state propaganda echoes these themes again and again and again. So Meyer Litvak, who is director of the Center for Iran Studies at Tel Aviv University, in 2013 published a study of Iranian Shiite anti-Semitism, past and present. He made the following statement. State-run Iranian television regularly broadcasts documentaries and drama shows based on the protocols of the elders of Zion. Such programs claim that the state of Israel was founded on the basis of the protocols which exposed the Jewish plot to take over the world. Another series of studies by the Middle East Media Research Institute in 2013, a series of 3 studies, documented depictions of the Jews in the Iranian media. And they reached this conclusion. Senior Iranian officials and major media outlets, quote, typically denounce Jews at large, attribute to them unique negative characteristics, and depict them as an eternal force for evil and the root of evil in the world since ancient times. Perceptions which have their theological and psychological roots in early Islamic traditions. Here's an example. This is from a talk given by Mehdi Tayeb, an advisor to the Supreme Leader of Iran, Khamenei. This was published on the internet in 2013. Mehdi Tayeb says this: the one thing the Jews want is to take over the entire world. Therefore, all the Muslims must be killed because they do not accept Jewish supremacy. They must all be killed. The only ones who need an atomic bomb in order to become global are the Jews. In order to become global, the Jews must kill Muslims en masse. So very similar to the claims Hitler made that there's a Jewish plot to exterminate non-Jews. Again, taken from the protocols and now interpreted in light of Islamic history. So here's a quote from the leader of the so-called moderate faction in the Iranian regime. There are factional divisions within the Iranian regime. There's no doubt about that. And the 2 main factions are the ones led by the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei himself, who has the real power, ultimately, over every branch of the Iranian government. I would not use the word moderate. I would say there's an ideological faction led by Ayatollah Khamenei, and then there's a pragmatic faction led by Rafsanjani. He's not just a moderate or pragmatic. He is the leader of the pragmatic faction. The difference, however, is not a difference in worldview or ultimate goals. It's a difference about pragmatic issues, tactics, timing, how we want to get to these ultimate goals. So Rafsanjani said in 2007 about the Nazis, this was, by the way, this was at a celebration of Jerusalem Day, Quds Day, which is an annual event held by the Iranian regime, centered on the Iranian obligation to liberate Jerusalem, that is, to destroy Israel and take it back for the Muslims. The foreign force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps is called the Quds Force. Quds means Jerusalem in Arabic. So the foreign legion, so to speak, of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps is the Jerusalem force. Their goal ultimately is to take back Jerusalem. And they are the ones who are now leading the Shiite militias in Iraq, leading the Shiite and Alawite militias in Syria. They have been the primary liaisons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And right now, the head of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, is personally commanding the Shiite militias in the takeover, in the attack on Mosul in northern So here is what he said. The Nazis, quote, first objective was to free Europe from the evils of Zionism because, quote, the Zionists constituted a strong political party in Europe, causing much disorder there. Since the Zionists had a lot of property and controlled an empire of propaganda, they made the European governments helpless. So notice that the so-called moderate Rafsanjani is here obliterating any distinction between Zionists and Jews. They're the same, no difference. And he is engaged in the same paranoid conspiracy thinking focused on Jews that we find in Khomeini and other Iranian leaders. What were the Nazis doing? The Nazis were simply trying to defend Germany against the Jewish conspiracy, which had rendered the Europeans helpless. World War II and the Holocaust have to be seen as legitimate efforts of self-defense by the German people against the Zionists, in other words. This is how moderates speak in Iran. So, what is then the logic behind Iranian threats to destroy Israel? Well, if Israel is the leading edge of the global ancient Jewish conspiracy to annihilate Islam, then it has to be destroyed. I would add the same logic applies to the US, which in their view is controlled by the Jews. And the threats to destroy Israel are ubiquitous. They are virtually daily. They are made by officials at all levels of the Iranian regime. Remember when Ahmadinejad was president in 2005 to 2013 in Iran, he was making these statements about wiping Israel off the map, and some scholars with expertise in Persian, like Juan Cole at University of Michigan, were saying, oh, he's not really talking about the violent destruction of Israel, he's talking about, the real translation is, Israel must disappear from the pages of time, it's really not so violent. And you were left with the impression that threats to destroy Israel were not clearly a part of Iranian propaganda. So by the way, I have 2 copies of 2 articles. And if you want to know what my sources are, where I'm getting all my information, I have copies of 2 articles here. One has been published already, one is under review in a journal, where you can check out my sources. I have a footnote that is like a page and a half long, just documenting examples of Iranian threats to destroy Israel. There's no controversy about this. All right, so I would sum up with a quote from Esther Webman, who is one of the leading experts on Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism. This is from a journal article published in 2015. The alleged eternal enmity of the Jews to Islam is dominant in Islamist thought today, suggesting a justification for genocidal measures against them to free humanity from their evil. So I've given just a few examples from Sunni and Shiite versions of Islamism. There are many, many more examples. I give many more in the full article. This has become a central part of Islamist ideologies, both Sunni and Shiite today. So I can't resist just adding a couple more things, and that is that this topic is being almost uniformly ignored by the Western academic world, by the Middle Eastern studies establishment, by the social sciences and humanities, and by the Islamic studies establishment. There's a huge blind spot surrounding this issue. So just earlier this year, the social psychologist Neil Kressel, who's at William Patterson University in New Jersey, and Samuel Kressel from Brandeis published this really interesting article with the rather jargony titled Trends in the Psychological Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, Conceptual Issues and Empirical Evidence. And what they did was they combed through all the major social science databases, going back to 1940, to see what kind of literature has been generated by social scientists on anti-Semitism. Now stop and think about something. Think about how central the study of racial and ethnic prejudice is to the modern social sciences. If you've ever taken a course in psychology, if you talk to the folks in sociology and psychology, it's a major preoccupation. There's a huge amount of scholarship and teaching focused on racism and ethnic prejudice of various sorts. The article concludes that while social scientific aspects of the Holocaust have been studied in some detail, contemporary anti-Jewish hostility has been underestimated, and anti-Semitism from the Arab Muslim world has been largely ignored. There's kind of a conspiracy of silence surrounding this. It's politically incorrect to talk about it. It's not fashionable. It's not trendy. And in fact, in Islamic studies generally, as the great scholar Maxine Rodenson observed as early as 1974, understanding of Islam has given way to apologetics, pure and simple. That is to say, if you suggest that there's in any way a dark side to Islamic history, like anti-Semitism, you'll be attacked as an Islamophobe, a bigot, an Orientalist, a neo-Orientalist, and on the list of epithets goes. A good example of this is the biography of Muhammad that Karen Armstrong published in 1992. She says in this biography, anti-Semitism is a vice of Western Christianity, not of Islam. Well, this is just flat out false. It's diametrically opposed to the truth. It's not even close. But this has become, if you watch PBS, virtually every documentary on Muhammad and Islam that's come out since 9/11 features Karen Armstrong as one of the central talking heads. Her whole agenda is apologetic. It's to present a nice, soft, benign image of Islam to her Western audiences. On the political left, there are some astonishing statements one can find. Here's a quote from Judith Butler, who was a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. Those of you in the humanities, and you've heard of Judith Butler, right?
No, I've read her much.
She's a big name, right?
Big
She's
name.
very
Big
influential.
feminist theorist.
Yes,
Yeah.
very influential. She has not a household name, but a big following. So she said this in 2006. Understanding Hamas and Hezbollah as social movements that are progressive, that are on the left, that are part of a global left, is extremely important. Now this is so out of touch with reality that there's some deep pathology at work there. She is describing two of the most illiberal, totalitarian, imperialistic, and anti-Semitic political movements in the world as progressive. This is not just wrong. This is 180 degrees turned away from the truth. It's the exact contrary of the truth. There's a deep kind of pathology at work here, an institutionalized blindness. Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, said in 2009, Hamas is, quote, dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region. This is simply preposterous. This is again, completely wrong. So, what we have is a kind of institutionalized blindness surrounding Arab and Islamic anti-Semitism. I mean, just look at our own campus. I've been here for 27 years. In 27 years, there has not been a single event on this campus commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day. Not a single one. The only talks on anti-Semitism ever given on this campus are talks that I've given myself. Audiences like this. And, or how about the persecution of Christians in the Muslim world today? Numerically speaking, Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world today. There's never been a single talk on this subject at St. Anselm College in 27 years that I've been here. But we have Hijab Awareness Week, don't we? We have the Laramie Project. We have Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week coming up now. We have Martin Luther King Day, which is now Martin Luther King season. It's what, 4, 5, 6 weeks long now? So we have an institutionalized blind spot right here at St. Anselm College. We care very much about certain kinds of prejudice, and we completely ignore others and pretend they just don't exist. So I'll stop there and take any questions you might have. Yes?
To what extent would you say this is, within the Islamic world, it's Mideastern or Arab culture as opposed to Indian Muslims, or?
Yeah, good question. A very good question. Unfortunately, it's much more widespread than that. So the Pew Research Center and the Anti-Defamation League have, in roughly the last 3 or 4 years, published global polling data for the whole Muslim world, showing very, very high levels of anti-Semitic prejudice in every Muslim country. It's very strange that there should be anti-Semitic prejudice in places like Pakistan, for example. There are no Jews there. There's no history of Jews living there, virtually none. But when the Islamist group Lashkar-e-Taiba, Pakistani group with close links to the Pakistani military and intelligence service, when they launched their terrorist attack in Mumbai in Thanksgiving weekend, our Thanksgiving, 2008, the world was focused on the Taj Hotel, this huge grand hotel where the fighting went on for days.
And they were,
just
at the same
massive.
time, they were killing the
Right.
Lubavitcher.
Exactly.
Yes.
At the same time, they sent a squad
Yeah.
to attack the Lubavitch,
The Chabad, yeah.
Chabad Lubavitch house, way off the beaten
Yeah.
track in Mumbai. There are Chabad Lubavitch houses all over the world so that Jewish travelers can find a kosher meal and attend a Sabbath service wherever they go. There's one right here in Manchester. And they tortured and murdered the rabbi and his wife. And the children, I think, were smuggled out by the maids, and they only survived because of that. Right. Why would Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Pakistani Islamist terrorist group, care about that? I mean, obviously, this is much broader than just the Arab world. Yeah.
This is extremely depressing, especially today.
Right, like there's not enough reason to be
I
depressed today.
had to come and support you because I knew almost nobody would come today for lots of reasons. But you know I'm sympathetic to this. And what do you think, at the same time, I'm sympathetic to those who don't want to demonize Muslims, right? Because obviously we just elected a president who got there partly from demonizing Muslims.
Right.
Okay, and I think that's a big part of it.
Right.
People don't want to demonize. Like we've gone far enough in our country to know you don't want to think about huge swaths of people as the enemy, right?
Right.
There's also, of course, the Palestinian refugee camps that have existed for decades, and I know you can talk for 2 hours about that. So that's part of it, I think. But in your time here on this campus, Joe, do you encounter among the students anti-Semitism?
No, most are
They
students.
most just don't know Jews, right?
They don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a Jewish student. She's still here. A couple of years ago, but she said to me, "When I tell people that I'm Jewish, they don't even know what I'm talking about.
Well, exactly.
They look at me like I might as well say I'm a Martian.
Yeah.
They don't even know what that means."
That's right. And you know, my theory about anti-Semitism has always been my particular idiosyncratic one, which is that it's created by envy. Jewish people have tended to be brilliant and incredibly, I mean, Hollywood was created by Jews, right? There's so much creativity and genius among Jews. What was the study? They said European Jews were the smartest people in the world. I lived in New York City for years, and I'm going to say this, my best friends were Jews, and they were the smartest people I ever knew. And so I think that there's a level, what are Jews famous for? They're famous for being good at money. And people resent that, and literacy. So there's in a way, there's this, I've always wondered if there's a kind of envy of the sheer brains and tenacity of the Jewish people. Israel, little tiny Israel, that has fended off everybody.
Right.
You know, that goes and wins the 6-day war against all odds, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just spouting off in an emotional way because I'm emotional today. But
Yeah.
but it's like where does that anti-Semitism, now again, it can be traced back to everything you just said, right? So
Conspiracy theory is a conspiracy thinking is a convenient way of blaming one's own failures on somebody else.
Right, like
Powerful
Muslim
forces
is a
that
Muslim who's
are under my control.
Yeah.
It's not my fault.
Right.
It's their.
Exactly. And you saw this, I mean, if anything, in this country, we do have a giant anti-Muslim sentiment, much more than an anti-Jewish sentiment, right? So I think that the left is in some ways trying to counter that.
Although actually, if you look at the FBI hate crime statistics,
Yeah.
year after year, the largest number when you classify victims by religion, Jews vastly outnumber Muslims. Vastly outnumber.
Is that
Many more hate crimes
It's been
against Jews. For
This
years,
year,
this has been
yeah.
true.
Anyway,
But
that's
anyway.
all I have to say, really, just.
Yeah.
So I just have a comment on sort of half listening, but I think of the Jews as being a peaceable kind of people. They've never been an aggressor in history per se, right? Have they ever been a real aggressor? They've always knows, but seemingly.
Couple
big-
millennia.
The time of Joshua, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, they had to leave their home, you know, they were
3,000
always
years.
in exile or moving
Right.
or, you
Right.
know. So
Yeah.
it's striking to me that they were kind of lashed out at in a couple of different instances in
Yeah.
history, you know, by the Germans. And then whatever stemmed from
By the
that.
Russians under the Tsars.
Yeah, exactly. And then now here you see there's a history in the Islamic population.
Right.
So it seems like they're just, I don't know, like they've got this brunt of the litter kind of thing going on in history where people
Yeah.
just keep picking on them
Well,
Right.
for some strange reason.
spinning off that, if you look at the Western religions, the one religion that does not proselytize, that makes conversion from faith difficult, is the Jews.
Yes,
And I remember seeing, and I had no idea where I read it, who it was, that kind of undercuts whether we're talking the Crusades with the Catholic Church or the Islamists. It kind of undercuts the fact that we have to be out here getting you to be whatever, because the Jews don't need to do it. It's somehow the Jews give a lie to the other practices. And that
Yeah.
sort of, excuse the term, it's not theological, it pisses off the Pope or it pisses off the Muslims.
yeah, so they've often, and you find this even before Christianity, you find ancient Greco-Roman authors writing anti-Jewish tracts because the Jews are so stubborn. They insist on clinging to their own God and they refuse to, everybody else worships everybody else's God too, but the Jews won't do that. They're very standoffish. It's
Well,
more-
the notion of the chosen people, too.
Yeah.
But we're the chosen people, I don't know if that's part of it.
Yes, and that often is a
Yeah.
trope in anti-Semitic
Right.
propaganda and stuff. But yeah, Anne is right. After the last great Jewish uprising against the Romans was in the 2nd century, early 100s, and at that point, the rabbis kind of got together and said, you know what? They were crushed twice. Once around 70, and then once around 120 AD in Judea, in Jerusalem, and the rabbis said they kind of agreed on a kind of what became the universal Jewish teaching, which is accept whatever governmental authority you live under. Don't try to rebel ever again. Just wherever you live, accept the authorities and be obedient to the laws. And that became this, right, kind of really mainstream Orthodox Jewish doctrine, really, not just a custom, but the religious doctrine of Judaism after the Roman wars. So you're right. They don't. I mean, that is one of the paradoxical things is they weren't trying to take over. They weren't trying to conquer the world.
Right, they weren't the Ottoman Turks, right? I mean, they weren't like aggressively kind of pursuing property and peoples, invading
Yes.
places and all that, right?
Right, exactly. Or for that matter, the European Christian powers that
Yes.
were building empires too.
Right.
Yeah.
No, so I married into a Jewish family, and there's Orthodox Jewish in my husband's side, as well as secular Jewish. But it's always been strange to me how, I mean, they're fairly accepting of me as a Catholic, but still there's a real bond between them. In other words, they want to marry into their own faith,
Yes.
usually, even in the more secular part of the family. I mean, the Orthodox part of the family is very obviously devoted to their religion
Uh-huh.
and keeping kosher and all those things associated with their traditions. But the secular Jewish people, they still want to marry in
Yeah.
their own faith.
Assimilation is a big threat to Jewish survival in many ways. So you can sort of understand it.
I
Leo?
mean, if you look at like what constitutes Jewish identity from like 687 BC when they left not Babylon, but Persia.
Yeah.
The only things that were keeping their people together were these traditions of the one religion and the 613 commandments of these teachings. Like they no longer were trying to pursue a state; they were just trying to survive as a people,
Right.
remain a people. So they clung on to the idea of this staying a Jewish people, even if we don't have a Jewish state.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Very much so. Yeah. So. Oh, thank you for coming. At the same time, their daily prayers were towards Jerusalem. Their synagogues were oriented towards Jerusalem all over the world. And Jewish prayers and the Jewish scriptures are filled with kind of longing for Jerusalem. Every Passover service ends next year in Jerusalem, right? Yeah. And Jews have always, for centuries, longed to be buried in Jerusalem. Now, Mount of Olives is the biggest Jewish cemetery in the world. Going back a couple thousand years, Jews have sort of longed to be buried in the Holy Land. So the Zionist movement had this dream of returning to Zion, to the land of Israel, and that longing is deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition. So, I met, by the way, a couple of years ago, I got to know an American Jewish woman who was from Iran, and she got out just before Khomeini came to power. Her father wasn't so lucky, and he was tortured. Barely got out with his life. And she has family living in Israel, some in the United States. And I asked her, well, how long ago did your ancestors move to Iran? And she said, oh, about 2,500 years ago. So it's a very ancient Jewish community. There are only about maybe 10 or 12,000 left now, and they live under pretty horrible circumstances right now in Iran, as you can imagine. Any other questions? Now that I've depressed all of you. Cecile here has read the earliest biography of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq's Life of the Prophet of God. So you may, I have an article there called Muhammad and the Jews According to Ibn Ishaq. If, it might bring back memories of the course if you read that.
I guess the question that I would have is, this goes back to Muhammad, what he did to the Jews living in Medina, where
Right.
he ended up having them go out of Medina or
Yeah,
slave and kill
they
them.
were, that's right. They were all,
Unless they wanted to pay an extra tax or duty to stay there with
Right.
in Spain.
that theological conflict with the Jews that I described became a political and then military conflict, and Muhammad ultimately crushed the Jews. They were all either killed, enslaved, or driven out. Yeah. And on his deathbed, he is reported to have said, there shall be no two religions in Arabia. In other words, only Islam in Arabia. And so his successors, the rightly guided caliphs, I think it was Umar who did it, eventually expelled all the Jews from Central Arabia. Yeah. And to this day, Saudi Arabia, because of that teaching, that directive of Muhammad, Saudi Arabia does not allow any religion to be practiced in Arabia except Islam. Yeah. So a few years ago, Pope John Paul II donated a piece of land that was owned by the Catholic Church in Rome so that the Muslim community could build a mosque, an enormous mosque. I've driven past it if you've ever been in Rome. It's huge. The Pope donated, the Catholic Church donated this land. The King of Saudi Arabia paid for the construction of the mosque. Then Pope John Paul II said, hey, King of Saudi Arabia, how about letting us build a church in Saudi Arabia now? The King's answer was, no, we don't allow that. It's against our laws. It's against Islamic law. Too bad. We get to build churches in mosques. In your countries, you don't get to build churches in our countries. Nice little double standard there. Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Anne.